So welcome to episode 15 of 10-Minute Record Reviews, and today we're going to talk about Miles Davis's classic 1969 album, In a Silent Way. And what I've been listening to is a relatively recent reissue by Columbia, I think in the last 2 or 3 years. Sounds great, and I'll put the details in the comments below. So what to expect from this album? Well, this of course famously is Miles's first move into electric instrumentation. So obviously not including his trumpet, but the other instruments of the musicians he's playing with, moving away from acoustic instruments with which he'd been best associated, in adopting technologies and production styles that rock musicians had pioneered. It is still largely improvisational, but although it's not, I think it would be a stretch to call it free jazz. It still has, and Miles always retained a greater degree of structure than a lot of the artists who populated the new thing. Overall, this is soundscapes as much as you would consider them to be songs, and it's quite something. So as I mentioned, this is Miles moving into his electric phase, and that serves to freak everybody out. Miles Davis, of course, you know, in the mid '60s, late '60s, although his albums have not been selling that well leading up to this, is still, you know, a huge figure in the jazz world, and if not the hugest. And this change, much like, you know, Dylan going electric a year or two before, freaks everybody out. Freaks out the critical establishment. He'd been turned on to electric music by his squeeze of the day, a woman called Betty Mabry, who appears on the front cover of Feed to Kilimanjaro, one of his prior records. As I mentioned, people freaked out when this change occurred. Of course, they freaked out at Dylan. There was also a lot of contemporaneous freaking out by some of the early rock critics when heavy rock began to emerge in the late '60s and early 1970s. But it wasn't that surprising for Davis to do something quite different this way. This is actually his third major career innovation. The first being the move away from the bebop world and the birth of the cool in the late '40s, early '50s. Then 1959, again famously, his introduction of modal jazz with in Kind of Blue, where there's a move away from the constraint, in some respects, the stylistic constraint of using chord progressions, but strangely moving to modal jazz, which brought different kinds of constraints, but required you to improvise within those tight constraints. And now here we are with electric jazz, which really opening the door in part to a lot of the fusion stuff, which would follow, not just from him, of course, but from so many other people, including a lot of the people that he's playing with here, like John McLaughlin, Joe Zawinul, and other people. So from these roots, you get Weather Report, you get you get McLaughlin's opus in the 1970s, and so on. So this is also the first album he does with Teo Macero as a producer, and what would happen here is Miles and his group, a classic jazz date would have the group playing numbers. They'd play a number for 5 minutes or 7 minutes, might do it a couple of takes, but they would play songs start to finish, and those takes would largely be reproduced as they were recorded on the record. Here, Miles and his group are playing, I think there's 3 or 4 hours of tape, from which Macero essentially assembles songs, right, that then get presented as songs on the record. And this is the same methodology which was used later on the next album, Bitches Brew, actually much more so. But this is revolutionary, because this is not the technique that jazz critics expected jazz records to be made with, and so again, controversial. So in terms of the music, there are 3 pieces on here. One of which occupies all of side 1. The other 2, which are essentially a medley or a song within a song, occupy the whole of side 2. So side 1 is totally given over to Miles's composition, Peaceful, and again, right off the bat, you get the sound of electric instruments, which had to be startling to people who had followed Davis's career. You've got the organ comes in. You've got John McLaughlin's bent notes, so typical of electric guitar playing. As I mentioned before, very much a soundscape. Miles's playing is very textural here. There is some more virtuosic playing on the side 2, not so much here on side 1. And this is really I think the first real indication you get of where his playing is going to go in the 1970s. Side 2 is again, the two songs are In a Silent Way and It's About That Time. In a Silent Way is divided into two sections which bookend It's About That Time, which occupies the middle of the track, which occupies again the whole side, and each of those songs gets about half of the time. I would say In a Silent Way it's certainly my favorite Davis song of his electric period, although of course it wasn't written by Davis, it was written by Joe Zawinul. It is a beautiful, mellow, atmospheric song, and built around, again, there's a bit of a connection to, I was talking in another review about Ravi Shankar and modal jazz and droning notes and so on, and this is built around a single low droning note, off of which John McLaughlin and Wayne Shorter and others, they tethered to that, off they go and play. It's just wonderful here, and you've also got there's a lot of personnel, and it's hard to find definitively exactly who's playing what. You've also got Chick Corea and obviously Zawinul himself are playing here, and Herbie Hancock is guesting at various points in this track. So so just to stay with In a Silent Way, if that song on its own is released today, you're filing it under ambient or down tempo. The middle section, It's About That Time, which is a Miles composition, like the whole rest of the album, it doesn't really swing in a jazz sense, but it does have a really kind of metronomic beat from Tony Williams, which really grows in you. And Miles is soloing towards the end of that song of It's About That Time is easily his biggest stepping out on the album, and his most technical playing. It's a great solo. Then it fades out. We're back to the drone of In a Silent Way, and which again is just as beautiful as when it starts out. And then Miles has these long drawn out high notes, which bring the album to a close. Fantastic. So what to say about In a Silent Way? Well, this is an album for which appreciation has only grown over time. It uses the same production techniques and personnel for the most part as Bitches Brew, but to my ears, it's a far superior album. There are still some transitional constraints on the playing and the design of the music here, which I think serve the music rather well here. The constraints were further released in Bitches Brew, and this may be a minority opinion, I suspect it is, but I don't think it's as good an effect as on this particular record. This is basically a much more beautiful record musically, I think, than Bitches Brew. So it's the first album of his electric period, but it's his last great high point in my view. Again, probably a controversial opinion, but there you go. I give it 5 stars. It's an essential album for jazz fans, and it's also an essential album for anybody who's interested in musical risk-taking, for which Miles was very famous.